The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
And I wanted to pick up on a couple of comments that were made from the previous speaker, Mr. Speaker, a little bit earlier this afternoon, when he talked about the importance of global solutions and global leadership. And I'd like to cite a couple of very specific examples that I think that a good number of my constituents, and I would ultimately argue Canadians, can really sympathize with. When we think of global solutions and leadership, and you look around in terms of what's happening around the world, here are the two examples that come to my mind right offhand, Mr. Speaker. Members would be familiar with the Canadian garbage that was sent to the Philippines. That is something that occurred a number of years ago. When Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, the approach at that time was to see if, in fact, it can be resolved, but the garbage would stay in the Philippines, but they would try to work it out. Then it went through a court process, Mr. Speaker, and that was fairly exhausting. It actually literally has taken years in order to be able to get it to the point where it is today. Then you get a proclamation from President Duterte of the Philippines, a proclamation that I thought was quite fitting, given the importance of our environment, and he made a very powerful statement, and a statement that this garbage from Canada needs to go back to Canada, Mr. Speaker. And this is something by the President getting engaged, raised the profile of the issue. I believe, Mr. Speaker, what you have seen is that we have responded to that call for action as a government, because we do believe that those 69 containers of garbage should, in fact, be here in Canada. And we will work to facilitate that, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Regards to the start of the Parliamentary Secretary's intervention, he mentioned the good news story of the Philippines raising the fact that they've called his government out for not acting on environmental contaminants and containers that were shipped to the Philippines. And I'd like them to explain that, because here's what happened, Mr. Speaker, is dozens of containers of used diapers, other types of contaminants were sent to the Philippines, and they were sent in shipping containers, and they were left there, and there's been massive protests, there's been civil disruption, a number of things. President Duterte threatened to take Canada to war because the Minister of Environment promised to clean it up and did nothing for a year and a half. So how is it a good news story that it took the Philippines threatening to go to war with Canada because of another Liberal broken promise? It's embarrassing. It's not a moment of pride.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this is it's a private company that brought trash and dropped it off in the Philippines many years ago, just so that the member is aware of it. And there is a thing called a court process. There are a number of things that were at play. I believe that President Duterte did a big favor, no doubt, in raising the profile of the issue. And this is something in which, at the end of the day, our government has actually responded to. You know, it's unfortunate that the NDP want to try to make this an issue where I believe it is a good news story, that the issue is in fact being resolved. And if the member would like to have a further discussion as to why it's taken this long, I'd be more than happy to explain it in more detail to him.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will be splitting my time with the member for Drummond, and I want to touch on a couple of things. I'm going to focus some of my remarks on some of the consumer pricing issues that we have with regards to gasoline and fuel that hasn't been touched enough on this debate, because there are things that we can do outside of building pipelines and infrastructure issues related to that actually could bring greater consumer accountability, because there is a rip-off at the pumps taking place and there is not enough accountability. I'm going to lay out 3 of those different things. A couple of things I do want to talk, though, in terms of concluding some remarks, though, about the previous discussion that we had with the Philippines, and the fact that it's a so-called good news story from the parliamentary secretary that a nation where we have a strong historic relationship with us actually had to threaten to go to war with us because over 100 contaminated filled containers of human waste and other trash was sent to their shores and stayed there, and his Minister of Environment in the Philippines promised to take care of it, never did anything like another broken Liberal promise, but instead they decided finally to act on it. And ironically, just as an update, Mr. Speaker, there's 69 containers left. Canada said they'll finally take them back, so apparently that's good news, is that we're actually going to take it back, and there's a complication because some of them are contested with termites. So that's apparently a good news story by the Minister of the Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister. I'm not surprised, because they have very few environmental victories that are so-called reality.